Oh, I need to, yeah, okay.
Wow, okay.
Continue, okay.
Okay. Okay, there we go.
Okay.
Perfect.
Perfect.
Okay. So, welcome everybody. I'm happy to welcome you to this panel on country images and public diplomacy in turbulent times. And oh boy, we didn't even know what turbulent times we are in, or we will be in, when we actually submitted this proposal of panel in October, I think it was. And it was also supposed to be a follow-up panel from an inaugural panel that the Public Diplomacy Interest Group of ICA and the International Communication section of ISA were planning to have in Hawaii. So now this is our inaugural panel. And before we actually start, what I want to, I just want to say a few things how we've come to this the idea of this joint panel. So within the Public Diplomacy Interest Group, together with our Vice Chair, which is James Pament, and the Secretary, Steve Pike, we've been thinking a lot about how we can actually contribute to the growth of the field, and also to make sure that the quality of the papers that we as Public Diplomacy Interest Group within ICA, so how we can increase the quality of the papers that we get and that will eventually get accepted into the main conference, because the interest group is quite young, so this is just the 4th year, and we increasingly saw that every year the papers kind of got better and better, but there is still a lot of work to be done here, and especially since the field is so interdisciplinary, we definitely need to work more on that. So that was the starting point. And then last year in Washington, when ICA was in Washington, we met with Efe Sevin, who's the chair of the International Communication section of ISA, and with Kadir, who's also part of the ICOMM section. So we talked a lot about how we can actually move this forward and transform it in something maybe institutional. So this is how the idea of a joint panel at ICA and at ISA emerged, basically. And the idea is to try and have every year such a joint panel, so that we can encourage, develop, grow the interdisciplinary of the field, and ultimately contribute to better papers or more quality papers, but also projects of joint collaboration, maybe publications. For instance, we have for the Place Branding and Public Diplomacy journal such a special issue with the best papers from the interest group that we are preparing at the moment. So I'm thinking that together with Efe and with such a joint panel, we can continue with such initiatives. So produce publications more than just the conference. So this would be a bit about the history of this panel. The whole point would be to try and bridge the gaps between these two fields or camps that work in public diplomacy, one being the international relations perspective and the other one more communication perspective. And today, because this is our inaugural panel, the objective would be to rather make an inventory or gather some of the key questions that are out there at the moment, rather than having just some definite answers. And at this point, I would like to introduce the panelists for our discussion today. So thank you all for joining us. So I'll start with Professor Caitlin Byrne from Griffin University. Welcome. Constance Duncombe from Monash University. Natalia Grincheva from High School of Economics in Moscow. Steve Pikes, Syracuse University in New York. So thank you everyone for joining us. What I will do now, I will hand over to my co-chair, Efe, to say a few words about how we are starting this conversation. Thank you.
And I will really just say a few words because Alina did a great introduction. Yeah, when we first put this panel together, we basically had two ideas. There was one academic, more intellectual idea that Alina mentioned. The field has improved considerably in the last 20 years or so. We have moved away from single case studies. We have moved away from non-theoretical studies. So there's something going on. But if you look at the structure, still, we have a group of scholars that are trying to make their place within international relations, political science disciplines. And then we have another group that's trying to make their place, that's trying to carve out a space for themselves in communications, in public relations. But we really don't have public diplomacy schools of thought, public diplomacy theories per se. So one idea was, how do we get these different people start talking to each other so that they can start collaborating, they can start building theories, schools of thoughts. But on the other hand, we also had a very institutional question at the end of the day, because the PD interest group in ICA is relatively new. ICOMM at ISA is a little bit older. We started as an internet governance group. We're not large. Our membership really is around 100 people, and public diplomacy is one of the largest groups, topics of interest. But still, these are, despite the overlap in membership, we kind of have two different groups of people going to these conferences. So how can we come up with an institutional solution to these physical distance, if you will? And Alina and I were talking about what has changed due to the pandemic, and we kind of realized this might be an opportunity for us to think about more creative ways to bring scholars together, because scholars, when you say let's bring scholars together, they go to ideas conferences, and it looks like an international travel is not going to be possible in the near future. So in the lack of international travel, what can we do? How can we create an institutional mechanism that will bring the scholars together? And then this actually led to another question about the future of public diplomacy practice. Because at the end of the day, our practice heavily depends on the last 2 feet, as they say in the American practice. Yeah, we like broadcasting, we like storytelling, all those ideas that you can implement from a distance. But public diplomacy is also about shaking hands, bringing people together, cultural exchanges, student exchanges. If these are not feasible in the near term, what are we going to do? How will the practice change? So there came kind of, if you will, a third question. But today we are really not looking for answers. Hopefully we will discuss some of the questions. We'll try to formulate maybe some preliminary steps to take forward to make sure intellectually and institutionally we can encourage collaboration among scholars. That being said, I'm going to pass it back to Alina, and Alina can start calling on panelists one by one, and we can move forward.
Okay, so yeah, thanks, Efe. Caitlin, would you like to maybe start us with some ideas, either more general or more related to your work or projects at the moment? How do you how do you see things at the moment?
Oh gosh, nothing like being the first cab off the rank, is there? Look, I think we're in a really, clearly we're in an interesting time here in the Asia Pacific, and I think our focus at the Griffith Asia Institute has been very much on what's happening in Australia, but also in Asia and the Pacific, where we've seen some unprecedented response measures put in place, but that those response measures are going to make connectivity much more difficult. You know, the hardening of borders, the lockdown of cities, just at a time when I think we were concerned about issues around globalization anyway. This has really come in and come over the top of a whole lot of other global events to make the conversations around public diplomacy that more difficult. Certainly in the Asia Pacific region. I mean, here in Australia, I'm going to talk about Australia first, then I might talk about a little bit more about the region. In Australia, the nation here was about to launch a new nation brand campaign off the back of a foreign policy white paper delivered in 2017 that for the very first time articulated the role of soft power. It didn't talk about public diplomacy per se, but it did talk about soft power, and it's the first time soft power has been officially articulated in any kind of policy document in this kind of way as an enabler for ensuring an external environment that would be positive or conducive to the prosecution of foreign policy priorities for the nation. So that was a big deal. In that same white paper talked about the importance of foreign policy partners, domestic partners in particular, as co-producers of message and really trying to promote and amplify a story of Australia. And it was a story that was connected to interests, the interests of a free and open region, but also to a specific value proposition, a value proposition that sat around, being a successful multicultural nation, a democracy, a nation that's committed to tolerance, to equality of to equality, to individual freedoms, etc. So Australia, I think, from 2017 had sort of really placed itself in a position of thinking about soft power within its national power, national power projection, and as partners being involved in that, partners that might include various tiers or layers in government, as well as non-government, civil society, media, arts and culture, educational institutions, etc. As a side element to that for Australia was also a commitment to nation branding and a new nation brand campaign. And the nation brand campaign, quite distinct from this idea of soft power, was going to be driven by the Australian Trade Commission. So with a very much encapsulated within an economic diplomacy space. I can tell you a little bit about that because, you know, I know a number of people who had been spending a lot of time behind this nation brand campaign, probably the better part of the last 2 years, who are about to launch it. You know, and it related to a number of themes around grit and optimism and, you know, the Australian way of doing things, and was going to be symbolised by things like our wattle flower. I don't know if any of you know the wattle. It has a remarkable likeness to designs of COVID-19. It's like a little yellow burst of flower that looks like a little yellow COVID-19 thing.
Wow.
So in fact, you know, firstly we had bushfires, which totally kiboshed the whole idea of putting the nation brand, you know, a nation that was in recovery from really serious devastation from bushfires, could not launch a nation brand campaign, but then COVID-19 emerged, and that has really changed things altogether. So I think the situation for Australia has changed so dramatically that our public diplomacy is really trying to catch up. And you know, in this field where practice tends to lead theory, this is a bit of a problem, because I think we're seeing a lag on both sides. And where we've had some success in the past in terms of nation brand, you know, that pure economic diplomacy approach, we've also had some setbacks. So I think for Australia, this is a really testing time for the place of public diplomacy, where it sits in our bureaucracy, who has carriage of what might go forward. In the Asia Pacific, of course, it's a much more complex system, a much more complex picture, and we're seeing public diplomacy, I think, encapsulated or kind of subsumed by a broader issue, and that is the issue of strategic contest and strategic reordering, when the contest for narrative has become really heightened. So I'll leave it there, and we can all come back to any of those issues.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Caitlin, for getting us started. Constance, would you like, since we're in the same region, maybe to complement the perspective, and then we'll move across the globe?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Caitlin. That's really fascinating and horrifying to think that our wattle flower actually, as soon as that I was like, oh no, we'll have to redo all our Olympic uniforms and everything probably going forward.
Indeed.
But I just want to touch on something that Caitlin brought up in terms of the lag between practice and theory. And I think I'll just make a small intervention here, so you know, we can go to the other panelists. But one of the things that I've noticed is that there's a lot of work coming out now on like Zoom diplomacy, for instance. So and thinking about the different I guess technological platforms through which public diplomacy, or just, you know, diplomacy in general takes place. And I think right now, what we're seeing, particularly if you want to build up the, I guess, the strength of contributions to work on public diplomacy, is, I would argue, for a call for slower thinking. So thinking through what these platforms actually allow, but also, you know, there's a huge amount of data out there that could be developed, or, but you know, through interviews and through, I guess, looking at how, you know, this technology is kind of being integrated into the other existing social media platforms that diplomats and civil society actors and non-state actors have been using for a long time. But what does that actually tell us about what's actually going on? And I think what often happens is there's a rush to claim new practices through this of technological innovation without thinking through some of the more complex theoretical issues that relate to that, conceptual issues. And this goes to you know, claims about what Twitter is doing, which leads to technological determinism. So it's like, it makes people do these things, or Facebook, because of their kind of performativity, the labor that goes into the production of Facebook posts and the kind of socialization of how people post and what this means. You know, there are distinct practices that relate to that get overlooked in this surge for people to be, you know what's going on with these technological platforms. And so I think in the context of what we're seeing now, what I think would be helpful is to not think that these new platforms are going to produce anything necessarily better or different. There are frameworks that currently exist that we can use to understand the dynamics of public diplomacy right now, or the dynamics of, you know, state-to-state interaction, non-state interaction. And I think it's really important that we take a step back and really think through what it is we're seeing, because it seems to be a lot of detail, a lot of description, but not a lot of understanding the sociological processes that go into it, and how this influences diplomatic practice. So that's a big, that's something that I see often is in various capacities as an editor, but also as you know, as a scholar as well. That I think, yeah, so it's more like I think Anik Viven talks about the idea of academic slow thinking, and I think right now, when even though it's very confusing and complex and very scary, I think now is the time to really take stock of the tools that we have to understand what's going on. And I would also think about as well, seeing how, paying attention to the shift that key diplomatic actors are making as they move to different platforms. So we've seen recently the shift into Twitter from Chinese diplomats, and that's something that's really interesting. But that has also been going on for quite some time as part of an interaction with other African nations, for instance. So a lot of work is often focused on Eurocentric, what do I say Eurocentric, but global North states like the United States or the UK and other states in Europe. But there's really fascinating kind of, you know, diplomatic interactions taking place over social media between China and Africa as a kind of continent. So you have like China and I think Zimbabwe was one example. So I think paying attention to cases that are outside of global North engagement is a really important way for us to understand the kind of fundamental dynamics of these platforms without falling into that replication of conventional understandings of what, you know, soft power practices might look like. So that's what I think, which is a very long-winded way, but a lot of my work looks at social media. So that's where I think the interesting things are going to happen here.
Thank you. I think that is exactly the complementary angle that adds to the picture of what is happening in the region from a practice, but also theoretical perspective. And I think indeed, with this unprecedented global health crisis, what will happen is that the governance and the political economic models and systems and policies and practices will actually be under scrutiny. And even what has been taken for granted as a neoliberal model for governance, for instance, and the role of state, both domestically and internationally, is again under scrutiny, because it's very interesting here in the UK, for instance. This neoliberal state, in a way, has been so much challenged, or this neoliberal paradigm of governance has been so much challenged by the pandemic that actually we heard narratives of state intervention, which was in a way unthinkable before. So probably what I would say we'll both see in the practitioners and within the academic community would be some sort of resurgence of critical thinking to rethink paradigms, analytical criteria, methodologies, and practices, maybe. So yeah, quite interesting times ahead. So having said that, Natalia, would you like to jump in and move across the globe to how you see things happening in Russia, or maybe globally, or more linked to your project? So how do you see things?
Yeah, thank you, Marlena. I would love to jump in, but I don't want to move necessarily to Russia, because the last 3 years I spent in Australia, and I'm very sad right now that I haven't got a chance to meet Constance or Caitlin there. And my projects in public diplomacy, in soft power, in non-state museum diplomacy have evolved, emerged, and developed very much in Melbourne. So, and I would like to add a lot to what Caitlin and Constance have already discussed in the context of Australia. So yeah, this kind of practice-led development of the public diplomacy theory is the place, is the nature of public diplomacy studies there. That I felt, and my work was also very much, based on the empirical research in collaboration with actors, non-state actors of public diplomacy in Australia. So, and for example, Caitlin mentioned that in 2017 there was this green paper that emphasized the role of soft power. But she didn't mention that in 2018 there was a review, soft power review, a nationwide review process that actually solicited contributions from academics, cultural institutions, all different kind of non-state actors to help the government to actually understand what is soft power, how could we measure soft power, what is the importance about this concept, how it can help the government to unwield in power in the Asia-Pacific region. So in the context of this kind of very urgent problems, my project on the measuring soft power evolved. So during my time at the University of Melbourne, I collaborated with the Australian Centre for the Movement Image to actually develop the first in the world dynamic verb application that can measure and map museum soft power. I should mention that my background is contemporary museology combined in interdisciplinary study with culture and public diplomacy studies. So I collaborated with the Australian Centre for the Movement Image to actually understand, can we develop a framework that would allow to measure soft power and map soft power of a cultural institution. And why Australian Centre for the Movement Image? Because in the past 10 years, it had developed a very strong ambition to be a global institution. And it actually went global. Very much because it had a lot of touring exhibitions abroad. It collaborated and developed a lot of partnerships with different cultural institutions from different countries, especially from the United States and Europe. But my actual mapping exercise revealed that this Asia-Pacific region remained untapped at all. So there is only a few collaborations going on. There's only a few, institutions that are strongly connected to ACME. So, and what also was important in my work, and also which is related to this pandemic situation, is that right now, I think, and especially after the pandemic crisis, what all actors of diplomacy, state or non-state, will actually face is that the scarce resources, the economic crisis that we all will have. And this economic crisis will cause this, deficiency of resources that we can actually use to implement ambitious international programs or nation branding campaigns or whatever, right? And in this context, I think what will be really important is the use of new technologies such as artificial intelligence, machine learning, and data-driven approaches to evaluate public diplomacy efforts and impacts, and not only to evaluate in the past context, but more importantly, to predict, to forecast. Because of the scarce of these resources, we will need to think very hard, what can we allocate for something in order for us to go there and be sure to maximize our impacts. So, and in this context, again, what I have developed with Australian Centre for the Movement Image also laid the foundation for the use of artificial intelligence in public diplomacy evaluations. Because one of the layers of this mapping solution that I developed, it actually allows Australian Centre for the Movement Image to predict, to forecast soft power of its traveling exhibitions to different countries around the world. For example, right now, but I don't know what's going on during the pandemic, but right now it's a major exhibition such as Wonderland was going to be touring in different countries. It started in Singapore, then it went to Te Papa Museum in New Zealand, and there are, I think, other cities that it will visit include London, Tokyo, and some other, Los Angeles. So it's a huge tour around the globe. So, and I actually mapped and tried to understand what will happen if this exhibition goes to this particular locale. Can we predict, can we forecast, for example, the audience engagement with this exhibition? Can we predict if this exhibition will be interesting for the local audiences. How can we do that? And I actually do that by using artificial intelligence or algorithmic modeling based on the data that I collected for the previous ICOMM exhibitions in different countries, and recalculating, trying to recalculate, predict what will happen next. But what is also important is that I actually looked at each particular city as a receptive environment, which already might contain different cultural references to the content of that exhibition that will make it more appealing for the local audiences. So these are the new approaches, more targeted, more fine-grained, more focused to understand the work of public diplomacy across empirical framework, because this is the actual work which is going on with their cultural institution, right? And solves a lot of its problems for it. And on the other hand, we are kind of, trying to develop new ways, new approaches to study public diplomacy, and especially to focus on impacts of public diplomacy or impacts of cultural diplomacy. So this is what I wanted to add to Constance and Caitlin's contribution to the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the perspective. So really, really interesting. You showed basically us an example of how AI and new technology can be incorporated into the practice. And if I am to actually think of what Caitlin and you both said in a way, is how projects focusing on soft power that have been developed are now impacted by a kind of major disruption. So it's really interesting to also see what will happen. So this would be one of my first thoughts. Another thought would be, is really interesting how you both mentioned the use, for instance, in your case, Natalia, with cultural institutions, so how they can use that, and institutions always need this internal legitimacy, which is also the case for the Australian government that now wanted to push this soft power new policy. So it's really interesting also in terms of how important, and I see this as an acknowledgement, in short, of this internal legitimacy. It is now basically incorporated in the policy making around public diplomacy. But at the same time, to connect a bit the dots with what Constance has mentioned about slower thinking, what are we doing with all these data? This kind of got me thinking to what Nick Coldry and Ulysses Meja have been talking about in their new book around cost of connection, colonized by data. So a sociological critical view, in a way, of all these II. So it's good we have these new instruments and technology for us to use, and especially for public diplomats to use, to legitimize, to evaluate their practice. But then what are also the social implications of that? So with these thoughts, moving on to Steve in the US. So Steve.
Crossing the Atlantic.
Crossing the Atlantic.
And a couple of time zones here. So we're all partly free associating here, and so let me pick up that ball. It's particularly poignant, I think, what Caitlin said, that her country's entering an era where they were articulating soft power as a tool officially for the first time, and it's been used before, of course, but to actually write it down and say, we're going to make this a part of a strategy is a change. And it's interesting that here's a country that's about to pick up the tools of soft power, where I'm sitting in a country that seems to be putting them down. And that's a particularly strange experience on this side of the Atlantic. because we're not putting them down to pick up the tools of hard power as the United States has occasionally done, playing this balance of persuasion versus arm twisting in the international system for the last 70 or 80 or 100 years. We're just putting them down because it seems like we don't care. We have ceased to care what people think of us, at least officially. And this relates also to another aspect of scholarship that I know Caitlin is highly invested in, which is the domestic paradigm that sits behind any country's foreign policy, any country's public diplomacy, which is, where do you get the support of the public? And right now in the US, it's really frayed. It's really frayed. There are still obviously many people who see the need for foreign policy, who see the need for the use of soft power, who see the need for dialogue, and we should be talking to our allies and working with our allies, not arguing and fighting with our allies. But they're being outshouted for the moment by a fairly vocal minority that just doesn't seem to care. So there's a qualitative difference there in the way the US is putting down these tools, not to pick up some others in a moment of strategy, but because, we're done with this. That's particularly dangerous. I'm always very careful never to say that the US invented public diplomacy. We did not. The things that we do in public diplomacy, the actions that we take, the dialogues that we initiate have been around for thousands of years. Okay, we can draw parallels between the way we talk to each other, and you could draw parallels to Sun Tzu, which means this is thousands of years old. We did create the name, being the branding experts that we are, advertising and marketing, we created the name. It was an American Foreign Service officer who kind of coined the term public diplomacy in the 1960s. And we were a country that decided to try to work during our period of systemic leadership with a heavy dose of soft power, not just, imperial power or strictly military power, but to actually go out there and say, first, we'd like to work with you and try to be liked. If that doesn't work, we have other ideas too. But we put a heavy dose of soft power right into the middle of the mechanism for systemic management. If we don't want to do that anymore, what are the implications for that within the larger international system? This may be an episode. I don't know. Nobody over here can give you an answer to this one. So will the US decide to reassert some sort of leadership role 5-10 years down the road? If so, how? What will be the parameters of entering the international arena again, given what's just happened, and trying to assert a role of credibility to say, nah, that episode's over. This is now where we want to go again. Will we have the credibility to do that? Will other nations be a little skeptical? They probably should be. We're all skeptical over here. But where are we going to take this? If we decide we're just not willing to do that, if for some reason the political will, again, this relates to that domestic quotient behind the foreign policy, if we cannot recreate the foreign policy consensus in the United States that supported American use of soft power as a leadership force, as a leadership role, what are we going to use instead? Or who else will step into the fray? Will this be a multipolar world? Will some other large power step up and say, okay, we're ready, we'd like to try this for a while? And if they do, what will their choice of tools be? Will they use only hard power, a different mix of hard and soft power? Will they try to replicate the mix of soft power that the US used? Probably not exactly. Every country has got a unique culture and a unique approach. But which tools of soft power will they pick up? Which ones will they favor? Which ones will they try to work with? What will their domestic quotient allow, whether it's their public opinion or their own cultural preferences, right? So, I mean, Americans are Americans, for well or ill. We do things a certain way. Some other nation may step into the fray, decide to use soft power. but because they are different and they are who they are, they will express it in a very different way. So we've got a lot of questions here about this larger systemic change, and what that sets as sort of the box in which all the players want to play. The US has done something really upsetting. It has basically changed the rules. And we don't quite know what the new rules are. Oh, I thought you were holding up a sign. Now I realize you're taking a picture. Okay, that's cool. So there's that. There's this sense of where are we going here and what will the new rules be and how will that context affect the execution of soft power in the larger world. There's another question, and I'm not sure this is going to be terribly well explained. It may be a little bit inchoate, but we are still over here working hard on trying to find the common ground between IR, international relations theory, and mass communications theory. Very proud to say that, you know, of the two major programs here, and I wish that our friend and colleague Nick Cull were here today, because Nick is really just got a lot of insight on this, and I value his insights over the couple of years here that we've known each other. As one of the two major programs that explicitly integrates IR and communications education into what we try to do. It's USC and Syracuse with the two public diplomacy programs. We're on a daily basis struggling and working on what is the common ground between the two, what are the differences, what do they each bring to the equation. And I think that there's still room in the field for looking at the different expectations of the practitioners in each field, how they complement each other, where the folks on the communication side who draw a little more from soft power and lean towards the use of soft power, it's about being persuasive, being communicative, being liked to some extent. If you really dig down towards the PR side of it, the mutual understanding side. And the folks on the IR side of the equation who are, you know, look, we're trying to achieve a policy. We're less interested in listening because whatever the foreign party says, the policy is really not going to change. The policy exists in and of itself. So they're a little less sensitive to the listening part of PD. They're a little more willing to do the arm twisting than the communicators who are still interested in being persuasive. So I think we still have some room to forge in terms of where the preference for the use of hard power tools and soft power tools among the two sides of the house result in a difference in how those two sides approach the basic problem. I think we've been nibbling around that debate when we talk about what is PD. Is it propaganda? Is propaganda part of it? Is it totally separate from propaganda? But I think if we start to actually pull those two sides together into a common dialogue and first have them start to understand we're approaching the problem from a different perspective, one a little more hard power, one a little more soft power, and that relates to the expression of what we do in terms of this choice of tools, which very much reflects, you know, what Constance was saying. We've got to look at the tools and how they work and where they're coming from. I think we've still got some ground to work on there in terms of bringing these two sides together.
Thank you. Efe, would you like to continue and then maybe take over with some other questions, some other observations?
Let me start with the basic observation on the American practice and try to connect it to the studies a little bit, and then maybe we can move to the what is next question. Because yeah, I mean, as Steve said, the Americans did not invent public diplomacy, but they kind of did. They kind of did, because if you look at the birth of the field, it was single case US studies. Like early 2000s, we decided to move a little bit further outside. We started incorporating other countries as case studies, but still, in the initial introduction of these cases, they were always compared explicitly to the American practice. So the question was, does country A do public diplomacy as well as the US does? Right now, we do have non-American studies, even non-American comparative studies standing on their own, but the shadow of our knowledge based on American practice is still there. Even when you're not explicitly referring to the American practice, it's in our minds because that's where the knowledge comes from. And you look at the current administration and what has been happening to the American practice, that's a different story. The last time we had a real undersecretary, by real I mean actually appointed, not an acting undersecretary for public diplomacy, was when Obama was in office. Shortly after Trump got elected, the undersecretary resigned, and that was the last time we have had an undersecretary. Currently, we have an assistant undersecretary who is in a normal functioning State Department, who was supposed to have 2 or 3 more layers of bureaucracy before she could step into the undersecretary's role. But all those positions are right now vacant. Trump administration had a very narrow take on what federal appointments to make and what not to make. Ambassadorships, State Department appointments were not high priority items. So we have a lot of vacancies over there. So if that is the case, what is going to happen when, we all mentioned how practice leads theory in our field, and the largest practitioner seems to be abandoning it. Now, this abandonment, as Steve mentioned, happens every now and then, but based on administration priorities. But what is different within this administration is there's an attack. There's an abandonment of actual institutions that gave United States the soft power, its ability to act in international organizations. Most recently, defunding WHO. At one point, Trump administration picked up a fight with the postal union, and in my IR courses, around a decade ago, I was teaching Intro to IR. We kind of give postal union as an example of international bureaucracy that nobody cares about, but it's there. Nobody will pick up a fight with this institution. It's just there to fulfill a function with no politics. But that was not the case with the current administration. They even picked up a fight with that. So just to combine everything with the point Natalia made, we are also moving into a financial resource issue. We're not going to be able to spend as much money on anything that we have been doing. So in that sense, will public diplomacy be a priority for the largest practitioner we have observed in the last few decades? If the November election does not change anything for us, probably not. We're not even looking at diplomacy as an essential function, let alone public diplomacy. So if you're going to lose a good case here, what is going to happen to the study? How are we going to move forward? If I may say one sentence summary question that we should maybe be exploring is seriously what is next for us as practitioners and as scholars of public diplomacy. The world is changing, the practice is changing. What are we going to do next? Oh, yeah, that was pretty much everything I had to say. Alina, by the way, do you want to talk about the British practice a little bit, or do you want to talk about your own research?
At this point, to be honest, what I will introduce really shortly, because I really want to know what each of the panelists has to say about what's next. What I would say about the British context is an interesting perspective on competitiveness that was actually introduced by the government, saying in one of the press briefings, there was this very interesting angle. When everyone is a crisis, you wouldn't expect an actor necessarily to highlight even more this competitive or competitional paradigm, especially in an address to internal publics, because it was a press briefing, and I think it was it wasn't Boris Johnson, I think it was the health secretary, when they announced that they are starting the development of the vaccine program. It was especially labeled as, because the UK is one of the leading nations, we are the first to actually start a vaccine. And that sounded so wrong, because okay, let's see if the vaccine first is discovered, and then you can brag about it. So it was really, really interesting. And then I think it was a week ago, on Boris Johnson's Facebook account, appeared a very explicit statement saying, this is not a time for competition amongst nations. We should cooperate more. So that's a very interesting angle for how things are developing here in the UK, to be honest. But I would just leave it here, and maybe if we can take another tour around the globe and think about what's next. So should we keep the same order maybe?
Can I just jump in as well, just to say one thing? When we're discussing this what's next thing, maybe we can also introduce what can ICA, Public Diplomacy Interest Group, and ISA, International Communication Division, can do to support the plans for the next phase.
Do you want me to start the next around the panel discussion? This has been fantastic, and I know I started from a strange place, I suspect, but so good to hear everyone's thoughts. And I think what's great about this discussion is the ability to draw out those critical distinctions and tensions, and ultimately those tensions between international relations, where the state is the primary unit of analysis, versus potentially the communication space. And I come from an international relations background, but I suspect the unit of analysis is going to be really different. And I know my work in the, even coming from an IR perspective, I'm really keen to challenge the starting point. I'm really keen to challenge the idea that the state offers us that primary unit of analysis. We've got to be able to get beneath it, within it, across it. And that's where that idea of foreign policy partners for me is quite interesting, but also those transnational connections, constants that you talked about, you know, that emerge through social media and new technologies. So I think that's actually really exciting. And I've got this crazy page of notes in front of me. But I think just coming back to the analytical boundaries, I have actually, from an Australian perspective, quite appreciated the turn towards soft power, because I think it's allowed us to think about and maybe to talk across the analytical boundary between traditional and public diplomacy. And I would still argue that traditional diplomacy, our ability to provide leadership, to engage, to be visible, to set agendas within traditional diplomatic arenas is absolutely critical. And I think that's going to become more critical going forwards. In our country, and I know potentially this is an issue for the US, ensuring there is a domestic constituency that values the role that our diplomats play is really important. And we don't have that natural connection between domestic constituents and diplomats, and they tend to sit outside, for example, the budget process or the consolidated revenue process. So cutting funds from our diplomatic infrastructure is much easier than cutting funds from domestic infrastructure, for example. And I think that's a real challenge for us to overcome. And I think that's something that both international relations and international communications have to somehow find a common ground on, because ultimately we both need to we both need to be placing value on our diplomatic infrastructure and assets in the traditional and public diplomacy dimensions. And just looking forwards, you know, one of the things that I think has been really striking, there's been a brilliant report put out by the Economic and Social Commission on the UN's Economic and Social Commission on the Asia Pacific about responses to COVID-19. And you would think by reading this report that everything is about, for states, everything is about looking inward, shoring up, you know, economic systems, healthcare systems, social welfare systems from the inside out. But actually, when you get to the end of the report, you realize that the fundamental principles within this all suggest we need to put more emphasis on our ability to collaborate and coordinate across boundaries. And I think public diplomacy, both in its, well, public diplomacy in a virtual world is going to play a really critical role here. But it also highlights some real vulnerabilities for us because digital infrastructure and access to digital technologies is so uneven. So I think what we have to come to terms with, and it sits within a broader agenda of the Sustainable Development Goals, but we really have to think about, at a much more granular level, who is vulnerable? Who are the people that are vulnerable in this new world? Who and how do we actually try and even out the landscape? I'm going to leave it there, just a couple of thoughts, but I think there are a lot of practitioners in the Australian context who are thinking their role is redundant in a public diplomacy sense. I think we've got to make absolutely certain that that's not the case, and in fact they are equipped and empowered to think about their role in a new normal, and that in fact more than ever, we've got to get better at collaborating and coordinating across boundaries and across those multiple tiers within which we all operate, many of which are beneath and across state boundaries. And I'm going to go on mute.
I could jump in if the group is okay with that.
Sure.
These conversations are always incredibly valuable because when I hear you and I think about, you know, kind of the things that we're looking at over here, all of a sudden I just kind of turn it about 40 degrees or 90 degrees and go, ooh, there's a whole new angle on what we were seeing. I think I'm almost going to go to the opposite extreme of Caitlin, but in so doing, close the circle on the other side. And it relates to my own work. Right now, because we're in a period of such extreme change, I think that in some sense, we have to take a moment, step back, and watch how things develop. We do not know exactly what is going to happen. The rules and the constants that we've kind of plugged into the equation for the last 20 or 30 years have been altered. One way to approach that is, okay, sit back, game out a whole bunch of scenarios as to how things could happen, and then see which ones start to become more real, which ones kind of get shuffled off onto the ash heap of history, as they say, and adjust. So if we have some sense of where things could go and we see where things start to go, we can be better predictors and better advisors of how we think this will play out in the future. But the most important thing, I think, is we've got to find a way to monitor some of these changes. And I've noticed in the field, we are often looking at how change impacts the practice of public diplomacy. We've looked a lot at how technological change has impacted the predominance of networks over hierarchical communication, the change of technology from far more, you know, sort of direct broadcast type, one directional technology to dialogue technology to networked technology, and to how that sort of changes the dialogue and the role you have to play when you're in the dialogue. Personally, I am my collaborators here have started to look at the diplomat themselves. We believe that how you see yourself as a professional, as a communicator, as a professor, as a scholar, influences the words that bounce around in your head and that come out of your mouth. You talk to your colleagues differently than you talk to your kids, right? So the diplomat, and particularly the public diplomat, takes on a certain identity. And that identity is going to be affected by that individual's perception of who am I, what is my job, what does the outside context expect of me, what is my diplomatic function. And if we can sort of, we've been looking at correlations between how diplomats perceive it and how the general public, their own general public or other publics or other diplomats perceive the function and the role. And if we can sort of keep taking that temperature every now and then and use the diplomat themselves, the communicator, him or herself, as that sort of canary in the coal mine, as a barometer of what are the pressures on the diplomat, what is the diplomat seeing as the context in which they operate, we can see if it changes. And then we could sort of try to figure out what's pushing that change. Is it perception of the job? Is it political circumstance? We've gotten some interesting results looking at political expectations of diplomats. We're kind of eager to see if we get a new administration or a new context in a couple of years, will that context change and will diplomats respond? If they don't, see, there's two parts to this equation. If they change, what drove the change? If they don't, what are they using to hold firm? What traditions, beliefs, professional codes, what is it that's enabling them to say, I know what the public expects and what the public kind of wants in this moment, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to stay where I am and continue to hew to some set of diplomatic practices that define the profession. And I think maybe that can be a useful barometer to seeing where these changes go. We've got to monitor the changes though, because maybe somebody's a lot smarter than me. It's entirely possible. I don't know that we know exactly where this is all going to come out. So that's my thought.
Mm-hmm.
If I may continue this conversation, because I would like to argue with Stephen on 2 points. First point he brought up in his first talk, when he talked about, and I think he kind of undermined the position of the United States in developing this concept of public diplomacy. Because I'm a Fulbright scholar, and I think Alina is also a Fulbright scholar, and we all know that this program started officially public diplomacy during the time of the Cold War in 1969. And I can tell for sure as a subject of this influence of public diplomacy, because I experienced it on my own. I didn't necessarily like the United States before I went to study on my master's program there in Washington, D.C. I didn't necessarily want to go to the United States, but it completely changed my perception of the country, about its people, its values. I completely changed my identity. I never came back until this moment, 15 years later, to Russia after being in the United States. And there is a particular reason why I'm in Russia right now, because I am a responsible Fulbright scholar who needs to spend 2 years in the home country after having all these benefits to study in the United States. So I'm on my duties right now. I'm doing my duties very well. After 15 years, imagine 15 years global trotting, being in Australia, in Canada, in London, in France, at UNESCO, everywhere. So, and I must say that you shouldn't even undermine the position of the United States in the development of that. It's really a great program, and I would promote it forever. And until now, I receive invitations from my Fulbright community for a coffee talks during the COVID-19 and all this kind of supportive activities that make me feel I am a member of a family. It's a family, family of members from all over the world. Very smart, open-minded people who go and change the world. really change the world. So this is really amazing. And another kind of point that I wanted to brought up in response to your second talk, that you said we need to sit and wait and to monitor, and this is kind of applies a kind of very passive position or very slow position, which doesn't necessarily, you know, work well with my tempo, which is fast and like jumping in things and trying to experimenting, not necessarily successfully, but it doesn't matter, because the whole experience what matters. So, and I wanted to come back to this idea, this public diplomacy. Is it international relations? Is it communication? Is it sociology perspective? Is it something else? And I think, for example, in my work, I draw on the international relations theory, and of course, Alexander Wendt, social constructivism explains a lot in my, you know, exploring the phenomenon of cultural diplomacy, because it's social construction of identities. It allows different kind of actors to step in, to play a huge role in defining these identities and constructing this social world, which define what different powerful actors wish to do on the global stage and how they do things. But at the same time, and this relates back to sit and wait, maybe we already have something going on, and maybe we already have some knowledge about something that will be next. And the question that I wanted to ask in relation of all these theories that exist, whatever theoretical approach we have, or what we have at our disposal at the moment, are these theories actually universal? Are they actually applicable beyond the world of Western democracies? For example, I wanted to bring in this quote from American relations scholar of the United States, who said, Western categories such as states, for example, are not very important in non-Western thinking about world affairs, but forces, movements, parties, peoples, cultures, and civilizations are important. Also significant are interstate interactions that are actually international because they are intercultural and intercommunal. Neither war or peace are useful descriptions of international relations modes. Struggle is the mode of international relations. It is omnipresent, dynamic, and permanent. So this is the question. For example, let's take this very popular phenomenon of non-state diplomacy, and it is being argued that non-state actors and actors of soft power are part of democratic systems, because only in these systems, non-state actors can gain enough resources and access to power to actually go around the world and exercise their power. But what happens in non-democratic world, like Russia, where I am right now, or in China? Do they actually have non-state actors of diplomacy? And my answer to that question is yes, they do. And this is the special issue that we published together with Robert Kelly from American University of Washington, D.C. last year, that actually looks at all these cases, trying to recalibrate this theory of international relations that is very much, you know, within the field of Western democracies, which doesn't necessarily work well in China or Russia, but in a pandemic situation and post-pandemic situation, this country will play a more important role. And China, for example, is already a superpower, a military superpower and economic power, you know, and it's growing. And understanding this power and how things work within this power is very important at the moment. And we don't need to sit and wait. I think right now we already have got a lot of knowledge, and we need to tap into that knowledge to explore better what can we do right now together, what will be next. And I think one of the important questions is to understand how these non-state actors, do they actually exist, and how they work in such countries where democracy is not existing, like China. And there are some such actors. And because of the genealogy of these institutions, you know, because of very different cultural, political, economic contexts in these countries, you know, you have to understand it so much better to actually acknowledge their power, legitimacy, acknowledge their legitimacy, and see completely different mechanisms how they interact with other actors on the global stage. So this is my contribution right now to move forward this discussion.
Natalia, I tell you what, I'm going to play this part of the conversation for my former colleagues at the State Department Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, because you have just validated one of the greatest loves of my life, which is the Fulbright program and cultural exchange programs. I like to be careful saying that America, as an American, saying Americans invented public diplomacy. I don't know watch that wording. But I will agree, boy, over the last 70 years, did we put one big, huge cultural stamp all over it. And I've argued with my students, or I've suggested to my students, that one of the best things we did, we're really good at creating epistemic communities. And I think you just proved my point, because we do that so well.
Yeah, thank you.
Constance, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Thanks, Natalia. That was really interesting, and it's great. Yeah, as an associate editor of the Hague Journal of Diplomacy, thank you very much for pitching our journal. Everyone submit to our journal. It's amazing. But yeah, so that was a really important intervention, I think, particularly that edition around non-Western, non-state actor diplomacy. I think there's a couple of things that jump out in the conversation in general. I think one of those things is, as Caitlin also brought up, like the unit of analysis is important. So if we're saying, making broad claims about states being authoritarian or, global north states being Western liberal democracies, as in they're just these monolithic entities that don't have complex nuances and all this kind of stuff, we miss a lot of, I think, civil society action. And you can see that definitely, I think, in Russia and China, particularly if we apply the lens of feminist analysis, for instance. And so you see pushback and resistance in different ways. And social media has played a really significant part in that. Which has almost generated, and I don't want to say like a transnational application in any case, but definitely allowing the resistance to some of the, restrictions put in place on freedom of thought or freedom of movement to go beyond just that particular domestic sphere. So people are aware of what's going on. And that can just be as simple as filming yourself sitting outside and repeating a poem or something. And that becomes a kind of an artistic act of resistance. And so we've seen that kind of grassroots pushback really happen. And so I think you've brought up a really good point, because if we just keep looking at, non-state actors in certain ways, like NGOs, or I can't think right now what other non-state actors there are. That it will come to me in 3 days, and I'll be like, why am I thinking of that? But you miss a lot of these nuances. And the other thing that I think underpins all of this is that if we want to know more about what's going on, if we want to, first of all, sit back and wait and see what's going on, as Steve is saying, or if we want to jump in and use the tools that we have now, which is what you're saying, Natalia, we need to have people who know how to do this. And one of those things is education. And what we're facing right now, I think definitely all over the world, but particularly in Australia as well, is a significant there's a storm coming in terms of education. So, our role as researchers is not only to educate the general public, but it's also to build the new researchers of the future. It's to build the individuals who will move on to become practitioners. It's to build the individuals who are going to be, researchers in their own right. It's to build individuals who are going to go and, take part in some of these non-state actor engagements. And if we don't have the support in order to do that, I think that makes it very difficult. And I think that's something that needs to come into the thinking around how do we move forward when we don't have the capacity to support people to do that, to develop those skills in an educational setting. And that goes again, I think, to the issue around, like with the university closures is one thing, but if it's coupled with, for instance, with practices of not filling positions in the State Department, for instance, you can see that, you know, relying on expertise and the faith in people knowing what to do and knowing their job has really been eroded. And this also, you know, goes hand in hand with concern about expertise in general and the rise of, I guess, you know, what people might say populism and things like that, where there's a resistance to what people might see as exclusive knowledge. And so I think we as key people in the field, like, part of our job is to kind of facilitate a greater connection to learning as being something that's not necessarily problematic. And that is also to enable us to convince, you know, government apparatuses to pay attention to the role of our diplomats and to, you know, to support them, as Caitlin has mentioned. And, you know, thinking about how visible our thematic ambassadors are, for instance. In Australia, you know, we have some fantastic thematic ambassadors. We've now got the ambassador for gender equity. It was the ambassador for women and girls. It's been made a significant inroads to ensuring the empowerment of women and girls in the Asia Pacific region specifically. We also have the ambassador for cyber affairs. You know, Casper Klinger, for example, has been a fantastic representative of thematic ambassadorial engagement with Silicon Valley. So, you know, we can use those, I think, individuals or posts as to highlight the role of public diplomacy more forcefully. So I think there's a lot of things that kind of go hand in hand. And I think that as part of trying to make the connections between the, you know, ICA communication studies and ISA communication public diplomacy kind of networks, I think education is possibly where we can come together as being something that's incredibly important and increasingly undervalued because of a number of things, particularly which the COVID situation has really brought to the fore. So that's what I think. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally does. And thank you. Efe, we ended on this note of partnership between the institutional angle that is so dear to you. Would you like to add something to it?
Sure. Yeah, let me just very quickly do two things. One, I realized I made a mistake when I was talking about the undersecretary situation. Apparently, Trump administration had one person for 3 months, and since March 2020, there's not even an acting undersecretary, so there's nobody in the office. But I think this education point Constance ended up in is very important, not only because of the COVID situation, but also because of the expectations of our jobs. We kind of forget that our job when it comes to knowledge dissemination is not only writing articles or attending scholarly conferences. We are literally training the next generation of practitioners, and that's one of the most valuable tools we have our hand. What I've heard from everyone was, you know, despite our skepticism about what might happen in the future, we are also very sure that public diplomacy, through its unit of analysis, is kind of establishing itself a theoretical and methodological camp that is not necessarily within IR or within communication studies. So together with the education points, maybe we can take this, the unique need of a different unit of analysis of public diplomacy to build up, to carve a special, unique, unaffiliated space for public diplomacy. But you know, this was our first attempt in trying to bring ISA and ICA together. Hopefully we'll continue this. ISA's submission deadline is June 1st. We're planning to be in Las Vegas next year in April, from April 7th to 10th, 2021. Who knows, maybe we'll be able to travel at that point so we can continue the conversation in person.
Yeah, hopefully. I like to end on a positive note. I think we're kind of at the end of our time, but allocated time, virtually allocated time. But if there's any other concluding thoughts or remarks or ideas, by all means, please.
I just wanted to say that what you've done today is really amazing, and I enjoyed participating in this panel, and it was, you know, such a great pleasure to hear all these different perspectives and to kind of to face these very challenging questions. What next? How pandemic changes public diplomacy? I think we all think about it, but you know, separately, you know, and it's very important to be a part of this community. And what you've done is really deserves, you know, a prize. It's awesome. It's awesome to be a part of this community with other scholars across the world, with the help of digital technology to explore what is next. So thank you, Alina, and thank you, Effie, very much for that.
Thank you.
I would agree. I just want to absolutely echo what Natalia said. Thank you for doing this. It's interesting. We get to see each other kind of once a year or twice a year at conferences. Hey, this digital tech, we could do this anytime we wanted to. That's kind of neat.
Can I add my thanks? And how sad that none of you are on the Gold Coast. You know, that's where this conference was originally going to be. But it's really lovely to see people. It's really lovely to see you all virtually, and I hope we can connect again. Can I just add one more point? And I think just on this intersection for IR and communications sits around listening. And I know, Stephen, you talked about Nick Cole's work. And one of the things I'm so grateful to Nick for is for putting listening on the agenda. But I think we actually need to do that differently and think about how deep listening and how we can really engage more thoughtfully in that listening process with some of our key regional partners in Australia. I think that we have a lot of work ahead of us to engage in deep listening with our Pacific partners as well as with Southeast Asia. I don't think we do that all that well. And I think this is an area where the two practitioners from both sides and scholars and drawing not just on the face-to-face but on the digital resources we have available to us could be really helpful and could actually be helpful not just in the planning and delivery but in the evaluation of how some of our public diplomacy programs are actually rolled out. But I'm going to go back on mute. Really nice to see you all. And Natalia, I wish I'd met you while you were here in Australia, but nice to see you virtually.
I actually think, Natalia, I saw you present at IPSA. Were you on the panel with Roland? Yes, I remember. Yes. So I should have gone up and said hello because I was like, oh wow, that's really cool. But okay, so note to self, yeah. This is why this is better because now we can talk.
Absolutely, yeah, connected, which is very important.
What we could do is at a given signal moment, we could stop the recording and say, thank you for joining us to all the people who may be watching this, and then stop the recording and post that for them. And then if there's any sort of housekeeping, we could do that off the recording.
Yeah, just before we turn off the recording, I just want to thank you all for participating. This wouldn't have been possible in the first place if you wouldn't have answered our invitation. But my second idea is that this will be uploaded on the conference platform, which will more or less act like a chat. So either as a Twitter or Facebook asynchronic type of chat. So I would encourage everyone who has any ideas to share about anything that we've talked about, and of course everything we've left untalked about, disinformation, more about discourses, more about sociology of profession, of PD, to actually join in this virtual chat, because this is how we kind of gather more questions we can answer in our follow-up virtual meeting at ISA or at ICA, or why not we can create a new virtual event together to kind of follow up on this. So thank you, and do share any thoughts or ideas or comments with us. Thank you.
Are we going to stop the recording now?